And our first session is going to be led by our brother Tim Ross, who is from Florida. And he has asked me to do a short Bible reading. So I will be reading from the NIV, and it's Leviticus chapter 25, and it's the first 5 verses. Thumbs up, right? Right, Tim? Okay, very good. All right, Leviticus 25. The Lord said to Moses on Mount Sinai, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I am going to give you, the land itself must observe a Sabbath to the Lord. For 6 years sow your fields, and for 6 years prune your vineyards, and gather their crops. But in the seventh year, the land is to have a Sabbath of rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. Do not sow your fields or prune your vineyards. Do not reap what grows of itself, or harvest the grapes of your untended vines. The land is to have a year of rest." Brother Tim, his topic is shepherding through stewardship.
Well, good afternoon, brothers, and maybe even some sisters out there. I'm not sure that we're being totally exclusive with everybody meeting in their homes. So if any sisters are listening in, that's great too. Um, I'd like to also echo Brad and Kenny's sentiments about thanking those that put all this together. Literally looking forward to it. I'm Tim Ross. I'm from the Church of God of the Abrahamic Faith in Miami, Florida. And been a few years since I've been to any gatherings or shepherd's retreats, so I'm really excited about being here today. Shepherding through stewardship and what that is. Due to my title, I feel like the best place for us to begin is by looking at, what is stewardship, what it's all about. Then once we understand what stewardship is all about, then we can learn to shepherd our flocks using this guiding principle. So, stewardship in its most basic form is the management of that which belongs to another. And we will see that management can consist of many things. So, we know that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth and all things therein. Then He created mankind, and in doing so, He created the first steward. Because in the Garden of Eden, it was the full intention of God that man would have far-reaching responsibilities and privileges. For Genesis 2:15 says, "And the Lord God took the man Adam and put him into the Garden of Eden, and to do what? To dress it and to keep it." Now my margin in King James says, "to tend or to cultivate." Now tend, I looked these words up. Tend to is meaning to attend by work or give care, service to something, to watch over, to care for, to minister to. And cultivate is to prepare the land for crop raising. Now, there is another definition to cultivate, but I'm not going to reveal that right now. So, Adam was clearly being given a responsibility here. The inference is that God was handing over something to him, something to be entrusted. And this, of course, would have to be after something else has happened. And this would be the building of their relationship. There was to be an intimate sharing between God, the owner, and man, the steward. Now, in an environment of openness, God speaks to Adam, and Adam speaks to God openly. Now, however, to remind Adam of his place in the relationship, God placed on a tree, placed one tree, as a restriction. But first, we see God offered to Adam blessings. Verse 16, it says, "And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, Of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat, So he's referring to Adam that, by saying freely eat. This could be like, get as much as he liked, didn't matter to the Lord. Um, this emphasized that freedom and the permission of loving and graciousness that God offered. Then comes another emphasis, and that is in verse 17. It says, "But of the tree of knowledge and of good and evil, thou shalt not eat of it." This tree was the symbol of God's authority over man, his sovereignty. So God established the relationship, and in so doing, he made the tree of knowledge and of good and evil the only restriction to be placed upon the man. So this proves that man was to be a steward and not an owner or even a co-owner at this point. Because in stewardship, there is always some restriction, something to which the steward has no right. An example would be something like a manager of a produce store or a public market, and he doesn't have the right to just take any merchandise that's under his control for his own benefit, unless, of course, the owner says it's okay. So when stewardship is understood as a relationship of trust and faith in one another, immediately the question of responsibility and accountability comes into focus. Every man in a stewardship role, in order to be effective, needs to understand what are the tools of the trade, so to speak, uh, for his particular stewardship roles or role, depending on how much he is put in charge of. Are you running the household? Are you the keeper of the flocks? Are you going to be overseeing the farming aspect of things? Are you going to be in charge of the finances, or perhaps all the above? So this can vary depending on the size, the type, and the scope of whatever it is to be managed. Adam was actually given more than one role of responsibility than tending to the garden. So as we know, God decided that Adam needed a helpmeet, and he was created. Now both of them were entrusted with certain tools at creation, and this enabled them to administer the dominion over the earth. Now before Eve was created, God had decided to have Adam do something that I think was very profound. And I believe it also was a very huge responsibility. And it shows that God was willing to give Adam or mankind a greater stewardship role over the. Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over every living thing. So the extra task given him, while at first read it might seem like it's pretty simple, actually is very complex. Well, let's read Genesis 2:19. "And out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field and of every fowl of the air, and he brought them unto Adam to see what he would call them. And whatsoever Adam called them, that was the name thereof." So like I said, at first read this seems like kind of a simple thing. Okay, that thing over there is going to be a such and such, and this over here is going to be a that, and this little one over here, whatever it's going to be. But as we know, the names of the animals and the creatures, and which belong to which species, and the names and the meanings, this is a very complex thing. This was something that had to take a lot of time, intelligence, observation of traits, and Adam actually working in and around their particular environments, getting to know them better. So, the Bible tells us things in simple sentences that may not all really be simple. And because of brevity, um, it seems that in timelines they are very short, when in reality, this probably took an extreme amount of time. So what I'm trying to say, brothers, is that the role or the roles given to a steward are more than what meet the eye. And this takes me back to Adam's original role as the tender of the garden. How much foliage, vegetation, species of trees and bushes did Adam, have to learn about and take care of? Again, much observance and time, and perhaps even some trial and error was needed to get things right. Some trees and foliage, they might need wetter environments than others. Some need to be in drier environments. Some need to be with certain nutrients that are in the ground to flourish. And so, we think of the garden as having been perfect for the growth of all things. And yes, indeed, God did say that after he created everything, he pronounced them very good. Yet, Adam had to learn to perform his role and to perform it well before the watching eyes of the Lord. Uh, I once went on a trip to Costa Rica as my wife and I's honeymoon, and we visited this one location called Arenal. It was at the bottom of an active volcano, and it was so lush and arid and misty, and it felt cool and it was warm at the same time, and the natural beauty there was just exquisite. Um, so you felt that, hey, if I lived here and I had to take care of these things, um, hmm, I might let that thing over there dry up, or this thing over here get too wet, and it wouldn't look like it does anymore. So we have this inference to ourselves of a real responsibility to do our best. So, like I said, at best, you want to at least continue a status quo, so to speak. Or is that good enough being a steward? Well, it might not be enough. Earlier, I said that the word cultivate had another meaning than to prepare land for crop raising. And that meaning is this: to promote or to improve the growth of a plant or crops. Also, to develop and improve by education or training or mentoring. So, how important is this? Well, let's read Matthew 25, verses 14 through 30. This is the parable of the talents, as we know. Give you a moment to get there if you're opening your Bibles or hitting on your icons on your electronic devices, whatever it may be. It says, "For the kingdom of heaven is as a man traveling into a far country, who called his own servants and delivered unto them his goods. And unto one he gave 5 talents, and unto another 2, and another 1. To every man according to his several ability. And straightway he took his journey. Then he that had received the 5 talents went and traded with the same, and made them other 5 talents. And likewise he that had received 2, he also gained 2. But he that had received 1, he went and he digged in the earth, and he hid his Lord's money. After a long time, the Lord of those servants cometh and reckoneth with them. And he that had received 5 talents came and brought other 5 talents, saying, Lord, thou deliverest unto me 5 talents. Behold, I have gained beside thee 5 talents more. And his Lord said unto him, Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things. Thou into the joy of the Lord. And he also that had received 2 talents came and said, Lord, thou deliverest unto me 2 talents. Behold, I have gained 2 other talents beside them. His Lord said unto him, Well done, good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things. I will make thee ruler over many things. Enter thou into the joy of the Lord. Then he which had received the 1 talent came and said, Lord, I knew thee that thou art a hard man, reaping where thou hast not sown, and gathering where thou hast not strowed. And I was afraid, and I went and I hid thy talent in the earth. And lo, thou hast said that is thine. Thou hast that is thine. And his Lord answered and said unto him, Thou wicked and slothful servant, thou knewest that I reap where I have not sowed, and gatherest where I have not strewed. Thou oughtest therefore to have put my money to the exchangers, and then at my coming I should have received mine own with usury. Take therefore the talent from him, give it unto him which hath 10 talents. For unto every one that hath shall be given, and he shall have abundance. But from him that hath not shall be taken away even that which he hath. And cast ye the unprofitable servant into outer darkness, there shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So, brothers, we know this story very well. The two servants who gained more talents during their stewardship cultivated, they promoted, they improved the growth of what they had been in charge of. And that is one of the important takeaways of this parable. For the two stewards improved with time, and they didn't just maintain the status quo. Now, my Bible dictionary's meaning of stewardship is utilizing and managing all resources that God provides for his glory and the betterment of creation. So the two did well, and the third servant failed in his stewardship. And I also say, so did Adam. Now, Adam may have been excellent in maintaining the garden, caring for and nurturing all the plants and the environment there, and also as well as taking care of the animals. However, instead of providing for God's glory, Adam impeded on it. And in doing so, he eroded and he destroyed the betterment of God's creation. Let's turn to Genesis 3 and 17 and 19. It says, Unto Adam he said, Because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree of which I commanded thee, saying, Thou shalt not eat of it, cursed is the ground for thy sake, and sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns also and thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat of the herb of the field. And in the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till it return unto the ground. For out of it wast thou taken, for dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return. So the third servant, he was not a good steward. And the master in the parable, he gave to him as to his ability. So he knew what the servant was capable of. God, in his infinite wisdom, he knows the human traits that he created us with. When he first came to Adam and what has been with us all through mankind. So he knew what was inevitable in Adam, just as the master knew that of his third servant. However, I think the master in the parable thought that, his servant would at least do something. You should have at least put my money into the bank, and I should have received interest, he said. But you did nothing, and you were unprofitable. So Adam, at least, he went on and started to populate the earth as he was commanded to do, and he continued to cultivate, although his task was much more difficult now. So we see there are consequences to our actions as stewards, so it is best to have a measured and a purposeful approach to all that we do, and with whatever it is that we are tasked with as our responsibility. Yes, sometimes there has to be a balance to our approach. And this brings me to my opening reading of Leviticus 25, 1 to 5. Um, Now, I know Brad probably thought it was a little bit curious of a reading because he asked me about it a couple times. And I don't know how many of you, when he was reading, said, what the heck does this have to do with stewardship or shepherding? But let's take a look at it again. Leviticus 25, 1-5 says, And the Lord spake unto Moses in Mount Sinai, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When ye come into the land which I give you, then shall the land keep a Sabbath unto the Lord. 6 years thou shalt sow thy field, and 6 years thou shalt prune the vineyard, and gather in the fruit thereof. Unto the land, and the Sabbath for the Lord. Thou shalt neither sow the field, nor prune thy vineyard, and that which groweth of its own accord of thy harvest thou shalt not reap, neither gather the grapes of thy vine undressed, for it is a year of rest unto the land. So what does this mean? Well, let's take a look. What might have happened if the children of Israel had not known to practice this method of crop raising? Uh, they might have done more damage to the land and had real trouble down the road with either no crops or perhaps even a very diminished yield of crops. So the implication here is that the land was not to be exhausted or abused for short-term gains. So sometimes we might think as we manage our households of faith that we have all the answers and that we are tasked, with something burdensome in every way. But I go back to the unfaithful servant in our previous parable. It seems that the great mistake that he had made was in misjudging the character of the master. He said, Thou art a hard man. And the master seems to verify this in verse 26. But then he seems to go on and say something else in verse 27, that you should have realized I was giving you an opportunity to do something. So while the servant thought him to be severe and merciless in nature, he really failed to see what the master was all about. To understand the real generosity of the master was to have him experience the joy of service. Now, the parable of 10 virgins emphasizes personal preparation for the coming of Christ, whereas the parable of the talents stresses the importance of faithful service during his absence. In the opening reading, God told Moses what to tell the people, how to handle the land, and he counseled them on why the Sabbath year was important. So it's important and imperative to us, as stewards, to seek his counsel. While it's sure that much of what we need to do is obvious, not everything is always so cut and dry. The scriptures have more than a few examples of what can go wrong if we fail to seek his counsel. 3 come to mind. This is the story of a prophet who was deceived, even while in the very act of performing a service for the Lord. Yet his failure to A, follow his instructions, and B, not inquiring when it looked like a harmless alternative had been presented itself. But he didn't go back to the Lord and ask, is this the right way or should I follow your original command? And so it ultimately ended up being fatal for him. That's in 1 Kings 13, verses 11 through 24, if you want to read that. The second thing is in Chronicles 10, verses 13 and 14. We have Saul's fatal decisions, and they are accounted for us as well. Let's go to that, 1 Chronicles 10, 13 to 14. It says, And so Saul died for his transgression, which he committed against the Lord, even against the word of the Lord, which he kept not, and also for asking counsel of one that had a familiar spirit to inquire of it, and inquired not of the Lord. Therefore, He slew him, and he turned the kingdom unto David, the son of Jesse. So we see, again, not seeking God's counsel, and in fact, seeking other counsel was quite deadly for him. We also have faithful Joshua. Now, it's hard to think of Joshua making a mistake, but we know that in Joshua 9, 3 through 27, he made some missteps that proved ultimately costly to the children of Israel. This is when the Hivites, who were dwelling in the land, they set up this ruse of going to the children of Israel and acting like they had been on this long journey from far away. They dirtied up their shoes, and they took old moldy bread and dried up fruit, things like that, to make it appear that that's exactly what had happened. So they deceived Joshua, and Joshua, without seeking counsel from God on this matter, or any of the children of Israel, it became something of a burden unto them. So now that we know most of the guiding principles of stewardship, how do we best apply them as we shepherd our flocks? Well, I'm going to start with 3 words. Actually 4, but you'll get what I mean when I say them. Feed my lamb, feed my sheep. Now, these were the tender and meaningful words that Christ had told to Peter. So he gave Peter and us a responsibility denoting that of a steward and a shepherd. Feed, manage or take care of, those that belong to another, sheep, that which is to be managed and belongs to the other. So the basic meaning of steward is stated right here in 3 simple words, and the occupation of a shepherd is also implied. So what are shepherds, and what do they do? Obviously, they're sheep herders, hence the word shepherds, and they are said to be nomadic, meaning they move about from place to place and with good reason. The moving is usually seasonal and often follows a traditional route or a circuit um, according to the state of pasturage and food supply that is available. Now, ultimately, the route returns to the place where they are either going to be sheared for their coats or milked and slaughtered for food supply, or even as in the case of the children of Israel, for ceremonial use and sacrifice. Now, we know how important sheep were in scriptures. They were actually mentioned more than 500 times, and more than any other animal. And they were referenced in many ways. Now, shepherds, obviously, they play the largest role in a sheep's life. And their care for them is a very intimate thing on a very intimate level. Jesus says in John 10 and verse 27, "My sheep listen to me, they hear my voice. I know them, and they follow me." Other verses as well in Scripture describe close relationships between shepherds and their flocks. The shepherd not only protects the flocks, but he also dresses and nurtures any wounds, aids in the birthing process if it is needed, and helps any what's called cast sheep or cast down sheep. Now, I had never heard of this term before, but it is said that every shepherd has had a cast sheep at some point or another, and it's also said to be a very pathetic sight. The cast sheep, he lies on its back and he's got his legs in the air and he's flailing around. The shepherd must come along and go to his aid and get him back on his feet, or dire circumstances can occur. Perhaps this is what David refers to in the 23rd Psalm when he says, "He restoreth my soul." Now we see what the occupation of a shepherd entails, and I would believe that they are not paid nearly enough for their value and the roughness of their lifestyle. Of course, for us, monetary compensation is not a reason to take on a role of a shepherd, but as in the parable of the talents, for the joy of the service. So, how should we apply the role of shepherd, steward in our lives? Well, first, I might say that um, not every brother in service of the Lord should have the same role. And what I mean by that is taken from Ephesians 4:11. It says, "And he gave some apostles, and some prophets, and some evangelists, and some pastors and teachers." And for what? For the perfecting of the saints, for the work of the ministry, and for the edifying of the one body of Christ. So there are several roles to be had, and not everyone should be chosen for pastoral duties. And by the way, the word pastor in original Latin is shepherd. Um, but not all should seek or should have pastoral duties. In fact, some of the other roles are supportive of the pastoral duties, and that is very important in itself. As our churches and ecclesias, they get smaller, there is more reliance on fewer people, and so there's needed, fewer people to do even more. And so these supportive roles are quite the blessing. However, all of us can be stewards in a certain way. Each can be a steward in the sense of managing everything that comes into their life as a believer and in the manner that, honors God and impacts yourself and others around you in a positive way. But let's get back to shepherding. All right. Yes, it should be an intimate role for us, for the needs of our flock are very great. Psalms 23rd 1, as Brad had read, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." And no, brothers, our flocks should not want. And this is more reflected during this pandemic, especially with isolation. You know, loneliness and the loss of human interaction, it can be a very devastating thing in a way that many of us might not realize. If you're like me, I go to work every day and I interact with people at work, and I have done this since day one of the pandemic. So for me, it seems to be really, you know, nothing, almost nothing. But I say almost because I do miss terribly going to church, the spiritual interaction of our service, and with one another as we participate in the service, prayer circles, singing of hymns, going out to dinner afterwards. Those things are so precious, and I miss that so much. Um, but hopefully this will come to pass. But we also have the holidays that are coming up upon us, and the uh, tug on our heartstrings to be even with our families is even more, stronger than usual. We want to get together in larger groups, and we're not supposed to. So, what do we do? Um, and how do we meet the added challenges that we face in this time? Obviously, Zoom, as we talked about, has opened some doors for all of us, although it is still kind of limited in capacity. Not only are church services held this way, but we can also be used. It can also be used for group studies, and also for like we do down here in Miami, we do biweekly socials. So socials and studies, they work well in small groups. However, for large congregations or ecclesias, it's not as feasible and may really even be impossible. Um, as we've adapted under this pandemic, there are drive-by celebrations, distance visitations, going back to something that used to be considered a more intimate thing in its day, letter writing and sending of cards. That can really actually help to brighten someone's day. But how about other needs? How do we meet other needs of people? Some people may need us to go shopping for them, pick up prescriptions. You know, um, could be things as simple as cutting a lawn for someone or seeing to any kind of a household maintenance that needs to be done. There's a myriad of things that people need, and how do we make the time? In John 9, verse 4, Jesus says, "As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me." So let's talk about time for a little bit. Um, it is a value to sorts, and it's something that we should steward over as well. And when we think of things of value, we like to think of things of money and treasure. Those are things of great value, of course. And in money, the way we earn our money, we're supposed to be giving Are you hearing me now? How long has it been?
Just for about 3 sentences, Tim.
Okay, I'll back up a little bit. Did you hear me start to talk about time?
You were talking about earning money.
Okay. In the money aspect, we look at earning our money, and what we do with it is we tie the percentage of it, right? 10%. So with time being an equal value thing for us, do we give 10% of our time? So let's look at how much time we really have and see what that's all about. We have 24 hours in a day and 7 days a week. We're looking at about 160 hours per week. 10% is over 16 hours a week that we really need to be devoting to God and in some way. Now, man's days are usually spent doing what? Uh, we go to work 8 hours if we're lucky. Um, 56 hours a week is sleeping. So, with the 8 hours every day, that's 40 hours a week. 56 hours a week is sleeping time if you're an 8 hour sleeper. 30 hours a week, I was surprised to learn, is how much time we spend on TV and going on the internet. Seems like quite a bit, but that's what it says. Um, 10 hours a week we spend eating our meals, and 10 hours a week, myriad of things that we have to do in our responsibilities, going and getting our groceries or, whatever it is. Um, so that leaves really about 17 hours, or the 16 hours that we, you know, would tithe if we gave 10%. So that's just something for you to think about, and just throwing that out there. Um, One of the final points of our stewardship is one that I had mentioned earlier, and we are not to be just maintaining the status quo. Our goal is to give an increase, to improve with time, to hand it back to our master, in a better condition than the way that we had received it. Um, have we done this, brothers? This is one of the hardest things that I've ever had to write. and I can only speak of my own experience here in the Miami church. Built in 1960, I was born in 1961. The church was dedicated in 1963, and the founding members had created something very special. Surely establishing a church here in a warmer climate and a new bustling economy would be a huge draw for membership and growth. And boy, was it. Years later, the church was expanded with a Sunday school hall, which could be easily converted into hosting event space. There was a kitchen built into the back and some storage as well. And growth in membership was coming from inside and out. In the early 80s, we began hosting our midwinter gatherings, and the church was at its peak when I became a deacon, and then years later, an elder. So I'm kind of talking about this as if, this is things are happening under my watch, and that's why it's extremely difficult to say. At some point, things began to change. Members began to migrate away to places like Gainesville, Flagler Beach, and Orlando, which are blessings of their own, of course, but not so much for us back here in Miami. Some families were eroded by divorce, and there were other inward pressures also within the church. Other families slowly quit coming to service due to outside influence. We have lost some simply because we are not as influential as ourselves we should be. Um, we are not. We are now at the point of even further shrinking, and of course, we have aging membership. And we can't do much about the aging membership. We've lost some young and bright minds because we hold on to older concepts. And I'm not speaking about concepts of faith or our beliefs, but we're not a young and hip church. Um, I don't, our style of worship here is older, not wrong, just older. So this is really a tough thing to think about as a leader. But I believe it's worth mentioning regarding our topic today. Are we doing enough to promote our churches and to try and stimulate some growth? Are we even doing enough to reach out to those who have left us and gone on, who are past members? And then finally, do we have the correct leadership in place? And I'm gonna be closing with this. In many of our churches and ecclesias, ballots are being handed out, for election or choosing of church officers. Now, this is not the time for voting the status quo or a popularity contest. When you were handed your ballot, you were handed a responsibility. So, brothers and sisters, let us choose wisely our stewards so that they may shepherd our flocks. And I would like to close with 1 Peter 4 and verses 10 and 11. And every man hath received the gift, even so minister the same one to another, as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. If any man speak, let him speak of the oracles of God. If any man minister, let him do it as of the ability which God had given, that God in all things may be glorified through Jesus Christ, to whom be praise and dominion forever and ever. So I thank you, brothers, for listening.
Thank you, Tim. Much appreciated. Um, I don't know about others as you listen. He talked about um, his own difficulties in thinking through the latter part of his words there. And that's a question for each of us. One of the things that struck me kind of at the beginning of Tim's talk was asking if the status quo was good enough. And are we ourselves doing good enough? Or are we giving our best in the service of the Lord? And that's a question only we can answer. We have to think about how busy our lives get consumed by things that really want to take us away from God's word. How many of us are distracted by, I don't know, let's just say COVID or the election or anything of that nature? Or for, those like myself, and Tim indicated the same, work consumes us. I can find myself now, most of the time I do work from home due to COVID. Hours, run together after a while. And I definitely put probably more hours into work than I should. And what is it that I end up replacing? What is that taking away from? Well, it's taking away from our time of studying God's word, going through our Bibles, doing our daily Bible reading, things that really should be the first fruits, right? We should be giving our first fruits to God. And unfortunately, speaking for myself, so many times it's the second, third, fourth, fifth fruits, oh, I forgot to do my Bible reading today. I need to hurry up and get that done. So, does anyone, if we can unmute people as we go here, but if we have the option, I believe, to, you should be able to raise your hand, I think, or drop a message in the chat and we can get you unmuted if you would like to provide a thought or comment on what Tim presented to us.
I'll jump in real quick. Keith.
Okay.
First off, thank you, Tim. Excellent. Yeah, the two things that struck me are aspects of our life. Not just when we're together for church, when we're at work, how we are representing, with our family. That's huge in my mind. And do people even know when you're at work or that? People know on Sundays that I go to church. I come in, I leave, I come back. They expect that. Just as an example, but that's something we need to think about. Even if we're not officially given an assignment, we are given an assignment. We are stewards of His word. The other is the 10%, the tithing of our time, and even just doing simple math. Because I quantify things. If you take out 8 hours for sleep and 8 hours for work, that leaves you enough hours where 10% is 5.6 hours a week. So I got to throw out, do we put in 5.6 hours worth of work for the Lord? And what would it be like if all of us did put in 5.6 hours of work for the Lord? Where would we be, and how would things look if we actually put that effort? Just something to think about. But anyhow, those were the things I really pulled out and jumped at me. So thank you.
Welcome.
I'm not seeing any chats. Maybe if you're on video, you can raise your hand. and unmute. I don't know whether they can unmute themselves, Brad?
No, I will ask them to unmute.
Yes, you can. I just did.
Well, you're a presenter, so you're special.
Oh. I was going to say, there's hours and 24 hours a day. That should be 2.4 hours a day times 7. We should be given like 15 hours a week.
Yeah. If you take it off the top. So
Minus sleep time, so 2 hours a day. It would be still 14. And it's still not enough that we do, at least for me.
And one thing I'll share, like I said, if you want to comment or just either drop a chat or raise your hand, Alan, can we unmute Alan there? There you go, Alan.
The parable of the talents. I actually did a talk a year or so ago on that, and it's kind of interesting. Number one, we always think of ourselves sometimes as the one talent servant, but if you really look at what a talent weighed, if it was a talent of gold, it's worth over $1 million in today's value. So even calling ourselves a one talent servant, sometimes we want to be humble, or we want to say, well, that's not really a lot of gifts that God provided to me, so I'll just sort of take the easier path. But if we think about how valuable $1 million, if we're entrusted with that level of responsibility, we can't just say, well, because I didn't get 10 or I didn't get 5, I shouldn't do anything. So I think that's one thing to think about. The other thing is, if we compare with the parable of the minas in Luke, sometimes those are equated as the same thing. But if you look at that parable, all of the servants are given an equal amount. They're all given 1 mina, but they produce different levels of return. So I think of that one as a measure of faith. It talks about in Romans 12 about each person is given a measure of faith. And then what God is looking for is, how do you make that amount of faith grow? Some grow to 10, some grow to 5. But what we don't want to do is just hold on to it and say, well, I've got my faith and I don't have to do anything with it, because that's the one that's going to stand before the master and not have the well done given to them. So all of us are given a measure of faith, and we have to do something with it. We have to be responsible to let it grow and allow it to grow through prayer and through the efforts that we put forth to reward the master when he calls on us. So those are the comments I wanted to say, and I was thankful for Tim using that parable. So it reminded me of those couple thoughts that I had. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, one other.
Can I make a comment?
Sure, go ahead, David.
Yeah, sorry. I'm very Zoom unfriendly. Yeah, thanks very much, Tim, for your comments. I like the amount of time you spent with Adam and Eve. That was foundational stewardship, and there's probably a lot there that we could ponder. The Genesis record is very sparse about what went on, and I've often thought that they may have spent a lot longer in Eden than we realize. We assumed that the condensed narrative represented condensed time, but it's quite possible they spent a long time. But just a couple things. The whole concept of shepherding is very interesting, because as a hobby farmer in the wilds of southern Ontario, I raised sheep for many years. And it's actually interesting how little you need to involve yourself in the sheep's lives. When they have ample water, ample pasture, your touch is very light. Sheep don't like to be bothered. Your presence frequently upsets them. So you need to, really get involved in very circumspect sorts of ways. They do just fine. And I think having grown up in an ecclesia that was a bit heavy-handed and traditional, and having lived most of my life in another ecclesia that was maybe even more heavy-handed in its approach to stewardship and shepherding, I at this point in my life, I believe the most effective stewardship and pastoral activity is one that is very discreet and less rather than more. And I think, you know, as many of us have functioned in pastoral capacities and stewarding capacities and various roles in our congregations, I think we've all appreciated how unhelpful involvement is very often far more damaging than no involvement. And you know, what does it say in the Proverbs? Even a fool is counted wise if he keeps his mouth shut. And I certainly had to learn that the hard way over the years. And I think we need to be very careful as we interact with one another. And you know, traditionally, church eldership, and this is still the case in the world in general, you know, really they're self-appointed moral police, and that's not our role. We are not the moral cops in our congregations. That is not what we do. That's inappropriate. And we can, you know, warn, we can admonish, but I don't have any right to go into another person's home or life, and they got a judge to answer to, and that judge is not me. So anyway, just a couple reflections.
Thank you.
Very good.
One other thing that Tim brought out that goes in my category, if you come to Paravel and hear me speak, one of the things that you'll hear frequently is a comment is, that's not fair, right? I don't know how many times I go through the Bible and I think to myself, God, that's just not fair. That's not right. Why would you, you know, punish for that, right? You know, Peter's my favorite person. You know, he's, you know, to me, you know, he went out, walked on the water, right? I mean, none of the other apostles did, but Christ says, you're the one that has little faith. And, you know, I want to say, but Christ, you know, he stepped out into that water. But Christ knew Peter was capable of more. And Tim mentioned that Joshua, you know, someone that we think of as, you know, he led a battle against the Midianites, and, you know, with, you know, he went with way too few people to win that battle, but he trusted in God to win the battle for him. Yet, where did he fall short? It was in the simple thing, right? It was making a decision as to whether or not these people that looked like they were from a far land, far away, would be given peace and passage. We look at that in our own lives, and there's things that we want to say, God, I got this. This is an easy decision. I don't need your help or your guidance. But even as we find in Joshua, many times those little things have big implications in our lives. So never fail to, you know, before you make choices and decisions in your life, go to God in prayer and see if you can get guidance or thought, and use his word as your guidance in everything you do. Any other thoughts or comments? Really appreciate, I will say, you know, Tim and Kit both immediately after asking, they both immediately said yes. So as a speaker gatherer, that's very much appreciated. And you did a fine job, Tim, and I'm sure Kit is waiting in the wings and has a good message for us as well. And if you don't know Tim and Kit, they're brothers. So I called them the dynamic duo for this Shepherd's Retreat. So
Well, thank you, Keith, and thank you everyone for your input, and especially on the chat. I saw a few things come through on the chat as well. So thank you very much for your input and your guidance to help me out with things further along.
Well, Keith, I'll just throw in there, Brother David jumped right in too. So,
Excellent.
yeah. And you're right. You go start the day, start